the First World War. So we had an introduction, and then last time we talked about Versailles, and this time we have Mark Albertson back with us to talk about Iraq. And if you enjoyed this program, please do tell your friends. We have lots of historical programs, and right now we are actually planning more for the summer, so stay tuned for those. If you'd like to make a donation to the library, we have a donation box in the back. Anything, any little change will do. The pennies from your coffee this morning all go to great programs like this. And if you'd like to make a sizable donation, we do have donation envelopes by the coffee in the back as well. And I'd like to introduce Mark, and let's give him a hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right in the back? Yes. What? You got your glasses on. You can't hear me? Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. Third week in a row here, right?
Yeah.
Third week in a row. Although, yeah, this is the last of the World War One Trilogy, if you want to call it that. Although tonight's a departure from what we were talking about before. Basically, we were mired in Europe. We talked about the causes of the First World War. We talked about Versailles and the aftermath, which got us up to 1945. You really can't understand the war unless you understand that progression, really. However, tonight we're going to go to World War I, but in a different environment, the Middle East. Now, when we're done, you know, those handouts you have, if you want to talk a little bit about the Islamic State when we're done, based off what I tell you tonight, fine. Because what you're seeing now is based off what happened basically 100 years ago. And we're going to get into that. But to start this, we're not just going to go to 1914. We're not doing that. We're going back to 1763. That's where we're going. Now, why is 1763 interesting? And why is it significant? Because that's when the British East India Company insinuated itself into Basra, and that southeast corner of what we're now going to call Iraq. This isn't Iraq yet. Keep in mind, Iraq as a modern nation among the family of nations turned just 82 years old last October. That's all it is. Why? Because the British Mandate ran out on October 3, 1932. And it joined the League of Nations as a modern nation among the family of nations, Iraq, that is. But let's understand one thing. Don't understand this so fast. It was still not a sovereign nation. Why? Because in 1930 there was a secret treaty between the British government and that lackey they had in Baghdad, Nuriyat Sayed, which meant that even after the mandate ran out, the British government could station troops in Iraq anytime they wanted to. They could use Iraq as a causeway for moving troops from one side of the Middle East anytime they want. Who controlled the oil industry? You think Baghdad did? London did. Who controlled the intelligence service? London did. And Baghdad had to clear any major foreign policy decisions with London. Is this a sovereign nation to you? No. Well, we got to go back to 1763. Now, let's understand one thing about the British East India Company. You know, this was a state within a state. It was actually chartered by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600. 1600. They began to go to India 1612, 1613, and that's key here because India wound up being the crown jewel of the British Empire. Now, keep in mind, the French were also trying to insinuate themselves here, the Belgians, the Dutch, the Portuguese, so on and so forth. Of course, you know the Dutch are eventually going to get what we now call Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies. But there was a race for colonies in Asia. So what happens here? Well, the British eventually are going to oust their competitors. And a lot of this is the British East India Company. Now, the British East India Company, as I mentioned, is a state within a state. It's a large corporation. You know, this is corporatism in action here. You know, they're kind of the forerunner of Halliburton, ExxonMobil. You know, that's what they are. You know, keep in mind, you know, when you know our guys were in Iraq, guys and gals were in Iraq. Keep in mind one thing. You know, I remember my father telling me when he's in the Navy in World War II, we did our laundry. Sailors did the laundry. When our guys and gals were in Iraq, guess what? Halliburton through KBR was charging you $99 a bag to do the kids' laundry. Cost you $99 a bag to do your laundry? At home? No. So this is the difference between America and Iraq and America and World War II. That's a different talk. However, the British East India Company are going to insinuate themselves here, and by 1763, they open up an office in Basra. Now, the reason for it, if you look at any of those maps I include with Iraq, there's two rivers in this country, the Tigris and the Euphrates. I know you've heard of them. They've been in the news a lot. The reason the British were overly concerned about these two rivers, Russia, Tsarist Russia, this is 1763. One concern was that an interloper like Tsarist Russia would go down those two rivers into the Persian Gulf, through the Strait of Hormuz, and where are you? The Arabian Sea. And what was on the Arabian Sea? Colonial India. Of course, you don't have a Pakistan until 1947. But the fact of the matter is, that is a void the British were going to plug. You know how this works. Whenever you have a great power retrenched, someone's going to fill that void. Same thing here. You know, the Ottomans are getting weaker even in 1763 after over a century of warfare with the Safavid Persians over control of this place called Mesopotamia. I mean, they went back and forth, and it's Murad IV in 1638 that finally consolidates the area for the Ottomans. But I mean, after over a century of warfare, countries don't wear out, or monarchs don't wear out. They do. History proves this. So the British are going to begin to insinuate themselves here. Now it's interesting, 1763. 5 years later, the British government opens a consulate in Basra. 1798. Guess what? The British East India Company opens up an office in Baghdad. They're now moving north. What happens 4 or 5 years later? British government opens up an office. You see what's happening here? They are moving north into the Ottoman realm. Now keep in mind what's interesting here, and I might have mentioned this for the causes of the First World War. There was a treaty struck between Tsarist Russia and the Ottomans. It's called Kutchuk-Kamyarja. I don't expect you to remember that name. But the basis of that treaty in 1774 was that the Eastern Orthodox Church would look after Christian interests in the Holy Land. Now, you know what this is. This is just establishing a foothold in this area. It's all politics anyway. The religion means zero anyway. That's what this is about. However, do you still think the Catholic interests are happy with this? Not on your life. Because in 1853, Louis Napoleon forces the Ottomans to give the Eastern Orthodox the short shrift. Now the Catholic Church will oversee Christian interest again in the Middle East, and then this helps lead to the Crimean War of 1854-56. However, that said, the British see the handwriting on the wall after they're moving in. They want to make sure the Russians don't. In fact, as we go along here, you will see the British begin to build textile factories in the Middle East. They begin to string telegraph lines in the Middle East. They begin a steamboat service in the Persian Gulf. And by 1860-61, there are telegraph lines strung here. Now they're beginning to build some textile factories, and they're importing cheap Indian labor to staff the factories. Now, at the same time this is going on, you know, the Ottomans understand, because of the effect of the French Revolution, and I mentioned this in passing, these ideas of liberalism, democracy, republicanism, so on and so forth, that are beginning to leach, that were leaching their way through Europe, are leaching their way through the Middle East. It's fascinating. Both these areas at the same time. I find that concept fascinating. I really do. And while this is going on here, it's fascinating. The Ottomans understand the gravity of the situation. They come out with the Tanzimat laws in 1839. You know, at this point, you know, they want people to feel like now part of the Ottoman Empire. That's what they want. There's this growing nationalism. The Arabs want out. The Romanians want out. The Serbs want out. The Azerbaijanis want out. All these people want out. Well, what's going to happen to the empire if all these people decide they want to leave? Down it goes. So now, what they're going to do is make these people feel like they're included. Interesting thing here, though. The land laws. They're going to redo the land laws. Now, they're going to start to raise taxes on some of the landowners. You know what some of the landowners do? They begin to sell the land to richer landowners. Keep in mind, at the same time, I'm talking 1858, there were immigrants, Jewish immigrants, coming from Eastern and Central Europe now. Forget 1948. Forget 1918. Some of them are coming now. And as they're coming in, guess what's happening? Some of these people have enough money to buy that land. So land that should have gone to, well, you can call them Palestinians if you want, is not going to them. It's going to immigrants. You think that makes them happy? No. You know, the Ottomans are selling them out. And the rich landowners are selling them out. And on top of that, the rich landowners, you know, this clique of really well-to-do landowners who own the land, reduce the Arab people who live there to indentured servitude. So they're not happy either. This is the same program the British will use in Iraq after 1920. And they will cater to rich tribal sheikhs who will keep the people poor, overcharge them for the animals, the feed, the tools, and so on and so forth. Stalin's going to do the same thing with his program of forced industrialization. I think I mentioned this last week. Underpay the people, overcharge them for the shoddy goods, and the profits will be plowed back into building more factories. And it makes no difference where you are. It makes no difference where you are. This seems to be the end result in many cases. This was during the 19th century into the 20th. That said, there's another country coming up which the British begin to see as a threat. Germany. Going into the latter stages of the 19th century. I mentioned this again when I was talking about the rising German power. There were Germans who wanted to join this colonial game. Bismarck really did not. You know, there was an Austrian plan to put 2 million Germans in the desert and turn this into a garden. That plan didn't fly. But the Germans wanted to build a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad. The British were totally against that one. The Germans wanted to set up a steamship service in the Persian Gulf. They will, and they will at the beginning of the 20th century. But the British almost deny them this. So as the British are strengthening their hold here in the Middle East, they are seeing competitors here. Tsarist Russia, which always wanted to get into the Middle East, you know, that warm weather access from the Black Sea through the Sea of Marmara, the Dardanelles, into the Aegean, into the Mediterranean. You know, that Navy base Putin wants to keep in Syria right now. Now, the rudiments of this go back a long time. This is the new great game. But the great game of the 19th century features Britain, which is really beginning to strengthen their hold here, and also competition from Germany and Russia. That was another reason the British did not want to see a resurrection of the French or Spanish empires here in the New World. They didn't want to see that. Why? That means they got to come back here. They're stretched. They were stretched. I mentioned this before too. During the American Revolution, at top end, the British had 45,000 troops here. 10,000, at least 10,000 of them were what? Mercenaries. Remember the Hessians? Yeah. Yeah. Didn't have enough men. They didn't have enough men. However, when the turn of the century comes along, going into the 20th, 1903, very interesting. The Lansdowne Declaration. That's one for you to look up. That's interesting. Lord Lansdowne, the British foreign minister, comes out with a declaration to show you how important this area of the world is to the British Empire. Keep in mind, the more the British insinuate themselves here, the greater chance they have of plugging access to India. Now, this is 1903. The 1945 Russo-Japanese War is only a year away. However, looking at this Lansdowne Declaration, it's simple to understand the importance of this area to the British strategic interests. This declaration states that any foreign power, and you don't have to spell it out. It's either Russia or Germany. Any foreign power that goes to insinuate themselves in this area, that is in direct contravention to the interest of the British Empire.
This is like the Monroe Doctrine.
Yes, but there's another one. Fast forward 77 years. Remember the Carter Doctrine? Remember that one?
No.
That was in response to the Soviet Union. Any attempt by a major foreign power to get into the Middle East will be seen by the United States as a threat to its strategic interest. and will be repelled by any means necessary, including force. There are historians who say that the Carter Doctrine of 1980 was almost a carbon copy of the Lansdowne Declaration of 1930.
But wasn't the Monroe Doctrine attempt to bring about isolationism? I mean, the Carter Doctrine and the situation in Iraq is more an attempt to develop imperialism.
Well, part of the Monroe Doctrine was a response to the Congress of Verona in 1822, when the European powers, still trying to arrange that semblance of a balance of power, wanted to bring Spain back into the fold of that monarchical clique, that system they had in Europe. But they can't be a power unless they have an empire. So the idea was to send a large French army to South America and get those colonies back in Central and South America. And a year later, President Monroe says, "Get out, stay out. We don't want you." That's basically what he's saying. However, and who supports that? The British. Because now they're going into the Middle East. They don't want to come back here. They don't want to spend time, treasure, and men to throw the French and Spanish out. So that's one of the reasons you had the Monroe Doctrine. Yes.
Backing up to the Ottoman Empire in the Euro since 1453, do they have Persia at this time in 1900?
No.
Persia's under its own.
The Qajar Shah dynasty runs Persia, and at that time the British got the oil concession from them in 1901. Now the fascinating aspect of this, and I'm going to get into this in 2 minutes, is about how. In fact, I'll tell you what. I'll answer that question in 2 minutes for you. I'm going to get into that.
Okay. I'm just looking at the eastern border of the
Right,
Ottoman Empire.
right, and that's a great question
because it used to extend a lot farther east.
Right. Well, yeah, but you had that. You always had that. You had that conflict, that tug of war going between the Ottomans in the 16th and 17th centuries with the Safavid Persians. For control of that area, they're going to call Iraq. And that, one time the Ottomans had it, the Safavid Persians had it, the Ottomans had it. And each time each side had it, when the Ottomans, being Sunnis, had it, the Shias were under a thumb. When the Persians had it, the Sunnis were under a thumb. So that affects what's going on today. That affects what's going on today. But after the Lansdowne Declaration, yes, the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese destroy Russian naval power in the Pacific, weakening Russia. So the bigger threat now is Germany. However, in 1905, 1906, 1907, you see a movement develop in Persia. These people do not want the Qajar Shah dynasty to rule them anymore. And they want something like a constitutional monarchy. Can you imagine a secular constitutional monarchy in Persia in 1907 or 1908? Wow, how would that change the Middle East? Can you imagine that? Not going to happen. Why? Simple. After the even before the end of the 1945 Russo-Japanese War, that really started the ball rolling for the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution doesn't start in 1917. It starts 1905. Yep. Father Gapon on January 1905, when him and his followers present that petition for their grievances to the Tsar outside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And what's the Tsar's answer? Six the Cossacks on him. That's what he does. He six the Cossacks on him. Now, if he's not going to let his people have a constitutional monarchy, do you honestly think the Tsar wants to see a constitutional monarchy on his southern border? No. Do you honestly think the British want to see a constitutional monarchy in Persia if they've got the oil concession? Keep in mind, they're going to strike oil here in 1908, 1909. No, they don't. They don't want these people controlling the price of oil. Who do they want controlling the price of oil?
Them.
Yeah, that's it themselves. Right, right. So in 1907, they actually joined with the Russians to put down this attempt. And what happens here? The northern end of Persia will be run by the Russians. The southern end will be run by the British. And there's a middle buffer zone in the middle of Persia that'll be run by the Qajar Shahs. And this idea of a possible constitutional monarchy dies here. This is another thing that the Persians have against the West, or the Iranians have against the West. because the British and the Soviets are going to invade Iran again in August 1941 to make sure the Iranian oil doesn't get to Hitler. So within less than 45 years, the British and the Russians invade Iran twice. And you wonder why they don't like the West. They have a leg to stand on. Of course, this is all power politics, you understand. Having said that, in 1907, though, Russia, France, and Britain are going to get together to form the Triple Entente for the First World War. You know, they're going to broach their differences. The British are going to broach their differences in colonialism with the French and the Russians, because Germany seems like it's a greater threat. This is the same thing America, Britain, and Russia, Soviet Union are going to do with Hitler in World War II. It's not much different. This is big power politics, real politics. That's how it usually works. Having said that, yes, the Ottomans are really beginning to be undermined. There are so many axes to grind here with these people in the Middle East that you are beginning to see, especially among the Arabs, this growing nationalism. They want the Ottomans out, and they want to run their own. They want to run their own area. They want their own country. And in 1914, something comes up called the Damascus Protocol. And I'm going to hit that again when someone asks me about ISIL. It's important to understand the Damascus Protocol. April 1914. Now, this is 2 months before Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the Countess Sophie are going to get knocked off. What happens here is the Arabs, King Hussein ibn Ali, the keeper of the Hejaz, Medina and Mecca. All right, they want him to be the king of the Arabs. This is King Faisal's father. Remember Lawrence of Arabia, the movie? Yeah. Alec Guinness played Faisal? Yeah. No? This is his father. They want him to be a king. They want him to be the king of an Arab nation. And what do the Arabs want? Their leaders of this nationalist movement approach the British government. This is what we want. We want our homeland, and they want the British to help them. And what is this homeland going to be? A whole northern strip of what they call Mesopotamia, right out to the Persian Gulf. Back across what's going to be Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. That's what they want as an Arab homeland. That's what they want. And guess what's going to happen? The British are going to tell them no. Because at this point, you know, the First World War hasn't started yet. The Ottomans have not sided with the Germans. And to the British, who are the rank colonial power, they still see, even though they're tottering, they still see the Ottomans as that buffer to Tsarist Russia. Even though they're tottering, we can still use them. However, what's going to happen when the First World War starts? Italy does not side with the Germans and the Austrians. In the end, who does? The Ottoman Empire. Now from London, it's hiya buddy. That's basically what it is here. The British are now going to help the Arabs. And in 1915, another important facet here, the Hussein McMahon correspondence. This was Henry McMahon, the British procurator in Egypt, trading missives and cables with King Hussein. The idea of discussing an Arab homeland. And this is where today's disagreements start. The Arabs were under the impression they were getting Palestine. The British in the end always said, well, no, that wasn't going to happen, because of the fact there's more than just Arabs who live there. There are Christians who live there. There were Jewish people who live there. So why should it be just run by the Arabs? No, that's been the disagreement here. However, going into, yes?
There are Arab Christians.
Oh, of course there are.
And here's one of them.
Of course there are. But the British don't see it that way. The British don't see it that way, and this is part of the basis of this argument. However, the big issue here is in 1916. While these discussions are going on, and the Arabs think the British are bargaining in good faith, what's going on here? The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Here, the British and the French, in cahoots with Tsarist Russia, are carving up the Middle East without telling the Arabs anything. Yes?
In 1915, the area that the Arabs wanted as a homeland and wanted to include Palestine.
Right.
That area then includes what states today? How large an area was it?
Well, there was going to be no Jordan. That doesn't even
No,
exist.
right, because we know Israel.
Right. Well, the Palestine itself, later on with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, is going to be divided up into a 3-power condominium, they call it. And that's going to be Tsarist Russia, France, and Britain. This is with the 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now keep in mind that the British will get the most southernmost portion because that's closest to the Suez Canal. They're not sharing the Suez Canal with nobody.
So it really wasn't a very large area. When you take a look at it as far as kilometers, it was more strategic location next to the waterways.
Well, but the fact of the matter is, in an Arab homeland like that, all these people are in one homeland. They're not in a bunch of different countries.
Right.
You know, and that's what the British and the French do not want. They don't want these people concentrated in one country. Let's break them up. And that's basically the idea here. So while the British, the Arabs do not know about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, if you remember the movie with Lawrence of Arabia, what's his name? Yeah, Peter O'Toole. He wasn't a very happy camper either. He wasn't when he found out about this. In fact, I include a letter written by T.E. Lawrence criticizing his own government. You know, he was one of those last romantic warriors, if you want to call him that, I guess. But in 1917, what's interesting, the Balfour Declaration, the idea of establishing a homeland for Jewish people, right? Now let's understand one thing about this. You think the British were great lovers of Jewish people?
They're still not.
Of course not. You know, the British do things for practical reasons. You know, they don't do things for cavalier reasons. One of the reasons is Jewish soldiers in the Austro-Hungarian army and the German army. Let's understand one thing about Jews in Germany. Many of these people were Germans first, Jews second. There were many sincere and patriotic Jewish people in the German army. So how do you try to break down that army? Offer these people a homeland? Is this one way of doing it? Yeah. And also to get the Jewish people in the United States to get America into the war. This is 1917. However, the interesting aspect, this is the beginning of November 1917. However, what happened in 1917 as well? The Bolshevik Revolution? Yeah, remember that one? Well, what happened on November 23, 1917? The Bolsheviks make public the Sykes-Picot Agreement. They publish it, they got the records, they got the Tsar's records. They make it public in Investia and Pravda on November 23, 1917. Now, how do you think the British and the French look now? The Arabs had no clue about this. Even these people who want to set up the Jewish state didn't know about this. So what do you think their outlook toward the British is as well? What else are they hiding from us? So the Guardian, remember the newspaper The Guardian, makes it public on November 26th. They might as well. The cat's out of the bag at this point. You know, the French are almost like this. The British, well, you know, they'll get through it. You know, we'll just make an announcement saying that we're still adhering to the agenda of Arab nationalism. That's exactly what they do. But I mean, the damage is already done. The damage is already done. I mean, the Arabs don't trust the British anymore. You go into 1918, and finally with the defeat of the Ottomans here, you begin to see, yeah, the Arabs are trying to get to Damascus to set up that Congress so they can erect this state. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Now the Ottomans are going to collapse. And now you see the British now this is interesting here too. You actually go to 1920. You know, you've had a backlash of Arabs in Syria trying to throw the French out because the French are supposed to get this area per the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And the French are going to have to fight a war and a revolution to put down these people. They're going to, but they're going to have to fight a war to do so. Now keep in mind, Christians in Lebanon don't want to be under the Arab rule. They want the French to stay. They want the French to stay. in Iraq, or what they're going to call Iraq. That's interesting, because originally that area Mosul, that city's in the news a lot lately, right? That area was originally supposed to go to the French. That was originally supposed to go to the French. Well, guess what? The British changed their mind. They're going to include it in this country that they're putting together called Iraq. So Iraq at this time was 3 administrative districts, or vilayets as they're known by the Turks: Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. So if Basra and Baghdad were supposed to be originally Iraq, they've now added Mosul to it. Why? One of the reasons is the British know there's oil there. They're already getting the oil out of Persia, and there's going to be oil in Mosul. You know that. You know that. So now the French are angry. They're miffed. We're supposed to get this area. So the British throw them a bone. Well, we'll give you a 25% cut of the Iraqi Petroleum Company. That keeps the French quiet. So Mosul will stay with Iraq. Turkey, what we call modern Turkey, was not supposed to exist. This Turkish homeland, Anatolia, this was not supposed to exist. You know, you go back to the San Remo Conference, 1920. You know, the British and the French are trying to put down these rebellions going on in the Middle East to throw them out. And at the same time, you know, the French and the British people want their guys home after 4 years in the trenches. I mean, the British have lost 965,000 dead in 4 years. The French have lost 1,565,000 dead. Their people want them home. Their people want them home. Yeah, you know what's interesting about the San Remo Conference? 4 countries go to this conference: Britain, France, Italy, and guess who else? Japan. You're probably wondering, well, why are the Japanese here? The Japanese were one of the allies. They're really not getting anything out of this. But they're made to feel part of that club of great powers. Now, the Japanese are concerned with what's going on in the Pacific. They're getting a lot of those German possessions with the collapse of Germany, which expands the Japanese Empire. That's what they're concerned with. That's basically what they're concerned with. At this time, though, it's agreed that this thing that's going to be called Turkey later on is going to be carved up by the British, the French, the Italians, and the Greeks. So Turkey, as you see it, was not supposed to exist. A southeast portion is going to the Kurds, a truncated Kurdistan. Of course, the Kurds are not happy. They want more territory. The Armenians, remember them? One of Woodrow Wilson's favorite oppressed peoples. Keep in mind, there was a 2-part Armenia that we're going to be talking about here. Eastern Armenia in the Caucasus, Western Armenia in what's called Turkey. Now keep in mind, with the collapse of the Tsar, Russia lost the Caucasus for a while. The Bolsheviks are going to get it back. But for a short period of time, there was an Armenian republic, a democratic republic of Armenia. The idea here was to meld the Armenians in what is going to be Turkey with those Armenians in the Caucasus and have an Armenian republic. It's not going to work. Turkey gets together with the Soviet Union. They're going to take the western portion and make sure that that territory remains in Turkey, and the Russians are going to overwhelm the Armenians in the Caucasus. And as an independent nation, it's wiped off the map, just like Poland's going to be 20 years from now. The Kurds, they're not going to wind up with an independent nation in Turkey. They're going to be beaten down by the Turks. And who leads this effort? Kemal Ataturk. This is the Turkish War for Independence, 1919-1922. That's what this is. You know, the Turks are going to throw out. They're going to do away with Kurdistan. They're going to do away with Armenia. They're going to throw out the Brits, the French, the Greeks, and the Italians. They're going to throw them out. And Turkey, as you see it today, exists. That's with the Treaty of Busan in July 1923. In the following year, what does Kemal Ataturk do? Gets rid of the caliphate, which was an empty shell anyway. Iraq, by the way, goes into revolution in 1920. There are people here who now, are beginning to feel this nationalist semblance here in Iraq who want to throw the British out. The British procurator here is a man by the name of Arnold Wilson. He was a career British soldier, diplomat. He was also as a administrator in India, colonial administrator in India. So he was an experienced colonial administrator here. Got his teeth in India. However, he has that haughty outlook toward people like Iraqis and Indians. They're gutter types. They should be happy they're in the British Empire. Gee, does that sound like the outlook toward some of the American colonists? Yeah, it does. Yes?
Lawrence talks about the large number of British troops in Iraq at that time. Are they,
133,000 at one point.
is that primarily Indian troops, British Indian troops, or is that Englishmen?
No, a lot of them are British, but they're going to bring Indian troops in. And I'm going to get into something that's very important here because it affects it's almost a carbon copy of what you're seeing today. Yes?
I'm looking at this 1916 issue.
SykesPicot?
SykesPicot Agreement.
Right.
You say that happens in November of 1916?
Well, no, it happens in 1916, but the Russians make it public in November of 1917.
When does the agreement occur in 1916?
Well, they're drawing all these up all through the year of 1916. That's not public yet.
Including the spring of 1916?
Mm-hmm.
We actually had a slight problem in the spring of 1916
What's that?
in the West, in Dublin.
Oh, well, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the Irish Revolt. The Irish Revolt. Which isn't going to last.
No.
No, but yeah, you're right. There's a problem there for the British. However, that said, when you get back into what's happening in Turkey at this time and what's happening now in Iraq, you have a backlash starting in 1920. And that backlash, you see Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds come together to throw the British out. And they rise in unison in revolt, together. Together. Now keep in mind, the British have about 133,000 troops here. And in 6 months, there's 1,691 of them that are dead. And they can't put this revolt down. Arnold Wilson is not succeeding here. So the British government recalls Arnold Wilson, and they bring another fellow in. His name is Sir Percy Cox. Cox takes a look at this problem and approaches it a different way. You know that saying, divide and conquer? So what does he do? He favors the minority Sunni over the Shia, favoring them with perhaps land, maybe administrative duties, but he favors them over the Shias. And what do you think happens to the revolt? Collapses. But there's another reason the revolt is not successful. 1919. Anyone ever hear the name Sir Hugh Boone Trenchard? He was the godfather. He's one of those godfathers of strategic bombing. He's very important here. The reason being is that the Royal Air Force is new. Now, it was used to be called the Royal Flying Corps. They actually changed the name. What a day to change a name. April Fool's Day, 1918. It becomes the Royal Air Force. Now, by the end of the war, this is, for its time, a magnificent air arm. But what happens when a war is over with? Budget cuts? Weapons are sent to the boneyard? Trained personnel are mustered out? Well, this brand new Air Force, Trenchard needs a use for it. He convinces Churchill and other members of the British government that air power can be used to keep these villagers in these colonial areas in line. You don't need masses of troops. He convinces the British government that this can work. Guess what happens? 1920, 1921. He begins to employ this method of colonial control in Somaliland, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and colonial India, northwest frontier territory. And guess what? It works. Why? These people never been bombed before. They've never been bombed before. The British can save troops. They don't need to put masses of troops. And yes, going back to what you were mentioning before about Indian troops. Yes, they'll use Indians, which is why in 2002 when George Bush asked India, New Delhi, gee, you want to contribute troops to the coalition of the willing? New Delhi tells them, no, been there, done that, we're not going back. You're on your own. Yes?
What kind of battles were these? Is this all guerrilla stuff?
Some of it is. The British were also using, it's interesting, the Assyrian Christians, which they called levies. You've seen the 6 o'clock news. Some of these, the guerrillas in the Middle East, and even in Africa, using Toyota pickup trucks with machine guns on the back. That's basically what they were using in 1920. Only they were using Fords this time, with Hotchkiss machine guns. That's what they were using. Basic principle was the same. So what would happen is, whenever there was a village that rose up, they would send in these flying squads, and then, backed by British air power, put them down. And the British used to flatten some of these villages. I mean, these are villagers who just who wanted to be left alone, basically, is what we're seeing here. Yet air power is being used. Now, in 1921, Winston Churchill sanctions the use of poison gas in Iraq. Now, let's understand one thing about poison gas at this point in the history of war. The 1925 Geneva Protocol is 4 years down the road. Poison gas is considered a conventional weapon. So it can be used. It can be used. Keep in mind the British predicament. They don't want to commit a lot of troops. They don't want to spend a lot of money. And aircraft dropping chemical weapons can save a lot of both. That's what the Italians did in Ethiopia in 1935 and 36. Japanese did the same thing in China after 1937. In China, they were dropping chemical weapons on the Chinese. That's, of course, that's in direct contravention to the 1925 Geneva Protocol. But it works. It works. Now, keep in mind, where I work in Army Aviation Magazine, military people call this air control or air policing. I like the term the constabulary use of air power. To me, I like that term because that's basically what this is. At the same time, though, keep in mind, as Trenchard is using this on these people, there's one man who's involved in this on the ground. His name is Sir Arthur Harris. Anyone ever heard of that name?
Yes.
Bomber.
That's it, Bomber Harris. Bomber Harris begins to see that bombing these villages to put these people in line, he is going to transpose this idea, which he put into action against Germany after 1942 with Bomber Command. Only now, instead of burning down villages, what is he going to do? Incinerate German cities. He starts with Cologne on May 31, 1942, unleashing 1,046 bombers on that city. He always disagreed with the United States. The United States was always for pinpoint bombing, and Harris said that's a fallacy. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. He says you unleash a flock of bombers on a city. He says it doesn't make any difference what you hit. You burn the city to the ground. His idea was to dehouse 20% of the German workers, and production would stop. And he wanted us to go along with this. And that's why you had things like Cologne, Lubeck, Rostock, Hamburg. Gonna burn them to the ground. Well, that's what the British were doing in Iraq on steroids. Is basically what this is. And Sir Arthur Harris cut his teeth on this type of use of air power in Iraq and Somaliland. Interesting. It's fascinating. Now, I mentioned before, yes, what you are seeing with our use of the drone is almost, in a place like Yemen, is almost the same thing the British were doing. Why commit troops, especially when President Obama wants to cut back on the size of the Marine Corps and the Army, especially when they need a rest? So you use drones. Nobody's getting killed on our side. and a drone doesn't cost as much as a bomber does. Simple. It's the same principle, the constabulary use of air power. Of course, does it make you popular in that area? Not really. Not really. But my question always is, looking back at the British example, sure, it worked for Trenchard for a short period of time because these people had never been bombed before. But then the long-term aspects of this, you have to ask the question, the British still in Somalia? They still in Iraq? They still in India? They still in Afghanistan? Did it work for the long term? No, not there. But for the short term, yes. Interesting here, it's fascinating. You take all these different parts of this. Now, after that 1920, 1921 uprising, Sir Percy Cox begins to assemble a colonial administration in this place called Iraq. He brings in Indians from India as colonial administrators. Iraqis aren't going to be able to administrate their own country. The British are going to cater to a string of tribal sheikhs to run the land and keep the people in indentured servitude, overcharging them for tools, animals, and feed. The French are doing the same thing in Vietnam. They're doing the same thing in Southeast Asia. The French colons or French colonials who own territory. You know, you get into the 1920s in southern Vietnam, 25% of the landowners owned upwards of 80% of the land, leaving the people with little or nothing. Same thing's happening in Iraq. Gee, it doesn't make any difference, does it? If it's Iraq or Vietnam. You think those are rudiments for eventual revolution? You know it. Go to your own country. What do you think one of the major causes of the American Revolution was? Now, if it wasn't for this, we get this peace and freedom and so on and so forth. Let's go beyond that. That's the icing. Let's get to the cake. One of the reasons was the British no longer wanted these white colonial settlers taking territory from the Indians. Why? Because it was costing the British Treasury money to protect them. Keep in mind, after the French and Indian War, the British owed the banks a lot of money. They couldn't afford to maintain army protection for these settlers moving out west to take lands from the Indians. They told the settlers, no more, you're done. Well, picture yourself as a poor white settler who can't make it in the city. You want to move west and get some free land, right? Maybe you can start your own farm and make a few dollars out of it. Now they're telling you can't? Who the hell are you? One of the major causes of the American Revolution. Not much different than what's going on, what was going to happen in Iraq or Vietnam for that instance. It doesn't make any difference where people are. People are people in the end, no matter where or who they are. Makes no difference. Makes no difference. Now, going back to what I mentioned earlier about ISIL. Okay? Take a look at where ISIL is right now. Where are they?
Northern Syria.
Northern Syria, right, great. They're also into Iraq, right? They've crossed that border, right? They swallowed up Anbar province. They're going across the northern part. They're butting up against the Kurds. They're also butting up against Diyala province, which is a combo Sunni Shia province on the Iranian border. Now, since they've done that, think back to the Damascus Protocol in 1914. You see much difference here? I don't. They don't want that World War I settlement. Now, they're not the nicest people on the block. I understand that. But they're more than just religious malcontents, too. There are ex-Baathists from Saddam's party involved with this group. And they're secular. There's soldiers from Saddam's army, ex-Sunni soldiers involved in this. I mean, one of the reasons you have to assume that one of the reasons ISIL has so-called been successful in these towns and so on and so forth that they administer is because the Baathists have experience in city administration under the Saddam rule. Of course, you have to ask the question too. If ever they did get to Baghdad and take it over, is this coalition going to last? We don't know because it hasn't happened yet. And now your next point is, well, why would these Sunnis want to go with ISIL anyway? They're brutal. Well, look at it from their perspective. Look at it from their perspective. What kind of a deal are they getting from the Shias in Baghdad? They're not getting a great deal. You know, the Iraqi army fell apart, we know that. But it's not the Iraqi army, yeah, it's the Iraqi army they fear, it's the Shia militias that they fear. And some of these people fear them more than they do ISIL. So what's the alternative to an ISIL? Find one. This is a problem. This is a big problem. Now, one of the fascinating aspects of this, again, there's an historical parallel here. You remember last summer when the Iraqi army fell apart? And what happened to some of the equipment that we gave them?
ISIL got it.
Well, yeah, ISIL got it. What do you think happened in 1949 when China went red? Look at all that equipment we gave Chiang Kai-shek. Who do you think got that? 105 millimeter artillery pieces, trucks, tanks, machine guns. Mao got it. Mao got it. You see much of a difference between what happened in 1949 and what happened in 2014? I sure as hell don't. Look what happened in Vietnam after the army of Vietnam collapsed. I don't know, we sure can pick them, yes.
Has there been a stated goal by ISIS from, if they have a leader, from their leader or leaders about?
Al-Baghdadi?
Is it okay? And I mean, with, I guess the two questions. What's the demographic makeup of ISIL that you've heard? And then do they have a state or nation state goal?
It seems that they've kind of leapfrogged ahead, at least in theory anyway, from something like Al-Qaeda by proclaiming a nation state, which it really is not. But it seems that that's what they've done, Islamic State. Going back to what I said before about the Damascus Protocol, it seems one of their aims, if it's professed or not, is to get rid of the World War I settlement. Keep in mind, we assumed the mantle of colonial administrator for that settlement after 1945 when the British and French no longer could. So that's one of the reasons they don't like us. Of course, when I say us, understand too, I mean the West, not just America. But we're part of this. And having said that, there are people coming in, not just from the Middle East, from outside that area. I'm sure you know that. People from Europe. I mean, I was watching Frontline. Did you see that special on Frontline on the Islamic State? It was a couple months ago. Interesting. At one point in the program, they showed a bulldozer, an ISIL bulldozer. And there's one section of the Iraq-Syrian border where there's a big berm. And that was the border. Well, what do you think the bulldozer's doing? Plowing into the berm, right? And guess what? There's an Islamic State fighter, a guard standing there with an AK-47. You know what he says? This is the first of many borders coming down. Guess where he was from? Argentina. Argentina. You know, you can almost liken this in a maybe perverted form of a perverted sort of way to the Spanish Civil War. Remember that one? When people from even outside Europe went there to throw the fascists out of Spain. Almost the same type of thing. The rationale might be different, but that's a historical parallel here. Interesting that is. Interesting that is. Of course, you know, when you go back to the Spanish Civil War, a lot of that anti-fascist movement was perpetrated by the Soviet Union. You know, to keep the pot going here and to try to blunt fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. And even a number of Americans went over there. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade. You remember that one? In fact, up to a few years ago, I mean, these guys are old. They used to have yearly get-togethers. The Abraham Lincoln Brigade. We were the first to fight against fascism. It was a big thing for them. It was a big thing for them. And quite a number of them got killed. But you're seeing the same sort of thing here. Now, from what I understand with ISIL, fighters from that area are getting paid $400 a month. Foreigners are getting paid $800 a month, plus I guess room and board. Now the question is, where are they getting this money from? Well, they are selling oil. They got oil in Syria. However, one of the second or third largest cash generators for these people is selling priceless antiquities. I know you probably saw the newsreel photos with them breaking some statues and stuff, but man, some of it they're selling on the hot market and making money that way.
Kidnapping also.
Kidnapping also, correct. And they're also getting money from so-called benefactors. You can take a guess who some of those are. The Turks at one point were throwing them money. The Turkish border is open. A lot of these guys that are joining ISIL are going across the border in Turkey.
Are they considered Sunni?
Yeah, oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So the demographic then of ISIL is primarily Sunni?
Correct.
Yeah.
Okay. So David Brooks, a week ago, last Friday, wrote an op-ed piece where he described nationalism as the cure for ISIL and for some radical. And I actually saw him Monday in a seminar in Clausewitz, and he confirmed that. And I'm curious what your thoughts are. Can these people be attracted to, does ISIL have a nation-state goal that they're promoting? And can other nation states attract people with a sense of nationalism?
I give a separate talk called Arab Nationalism and Arab Socialism. And I go back to when Napoleon and the French Revolutionary Army invaded Egypt and the Levant in 1798. They were only there 4 years, but they brought a lot of those ideas from the French Revolution. Again, what I mentioned, liberalism, democracy, so on and so forth. Okay. And Napoleon also brought the internet equivalent of the day, the printing press. So these people are breaking their arms, making and handing out. What happened in Tunisia and Egypt with the cell phones and so on and so forth? This is the same type of thing. Yeah, it is. However, that said, yes, this idea of nationalism, which I mentioned a little while ago, is actually beginning to leach through the Middle East at the same time it's leaching through Europe. So yes, nationalism plays a part. However, unlike in Europe, which really isn't tribal or clannish, not to the extent it is in the Middle East, you see here what happens going into the 1930s. Michael Aflaq, a Syrian socialist, influenced by the Marxists, but not really a communist, influenced by them, helps to do what? He writes up the theory of Baathism, which is a secular movement. It's a secular party. Now keep in mind, there were actually two forms of Arab nationalism here. There was that pan-Arabic view, which Gamal Abdel Nasser is going to be the god of later on down the road, where Arabs are all part of one giant tribe or clan. Does this get back to something like the Damascus Protocol? Yeah, it does. And then there's that individual view of nationalism, which is more tribal. And they're going to collide. They're going to collide. Now, keep in mind, the Ba'athist Party, which was a more pan-Arabic outlook, is actually going to be frowned upon later on by Nasser. Why? Because Nasser wants to lead the effort. He does not want competition. He wants to lead the effort. He wants Egypt to lead this effort. He's no different than Stalin was back in 1933-34 when his advisors told him, well, we better support the Comintern in Germany and support the Rockfront Kampfverband, which was the Red Fighting Front, and we'll take Germany away from the Nazis and make it communist. You know what Stalin says? No, the way to Germany is through Hitler. It's not much different with Nasser. He wanted to control this movement. However, what happens after the 1967 war? Remember they lost that one? Arab nationalism begins to decline. Arab socialism begins to decline. All through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, even going into the 70s, these people tried nationalism and socialism, republicanism, the communism. And it seems like they've gone back to the old standby here. You can say they have. Many of the terrorists of the 60s, take somebody like George Habash, Naif Hawatmeh, people like Wadi Haddad. These guys weren't religious fanatics. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, General Command, so on and so forth. These guys were secular. They were Marxists. They were socialists. But they fell by the wayside. You have what you have now, which these current users of terrorism, wave the religious flag. But it's interesting how what you saw with this evolution of terrorism here, going from the 50s into the 60s. These guys were all secular.
Is there any secular, I mean, I don't understand Brooks' argument, and I've gotten behind a little bit of my current events here, trying to catch up. Is there any secular national movement? I mean, it seems like the whole nation-state system in the Middle East is collapsing. There's no strong, even in countries like Morocco. And I'm baffled by where there could be a hope of a nationalistic movement to draw away from extreme.
Well, it's hard when it's tribal. Egypt's really not a problem. The Egyptians are Egyptians. But you go to Yemen, that's tribal. You go to Iraq, that's tribal. Libya. I mean, Libya stayed together because of what? Gaddafi? You take them away, there's 158 tribes there. You think they're all going to get along? What happened to Yugoslavia when Tito died? It fell apart. It takes a strong man to keep this together. Something like this. And the idea like the British said in 1920, one of their excuses was to bring democracy here. We said the same thing. What, Western democracy? These people weren't weaned on this. So it's kind of a joke, yes.
If we look at the Middle East in terms of the population dynamics, the Kurds.
There's about 300 million people in this area.
Okay, the Kurds seem to be a fairly significant minority.
And they're spread out.
Armenians would love to have their homeland back, although there's fewer Armenians than there are. There's the Turks.
Right.
There's the Syrians.
Right.
And then there's the vast polyglot of Arabian Sunnis versus the Shiites on the Persian border. Would that be basically where you would see the lines forming in that area?
Could very well be. I mean, that's what happened going back to the 16th and 17th centuries with the Ottoman Turks and the Safavid Persians. That was the battle line. So is there much of a difference between what happened in the 16th, 17th centuries as opposed to what's happening now? I mean, keep in mind too, when you look at some place like Syria, and even Iraq, all right, you had a civil war, right? However, there's a larger picture. Iran would like to have more influence in this area. Saudi Arabia doesn't want them to have that. And then there's the larger picture beyond that. Putin wants to maintain that Navy base in Syria. We have a Navy base in Bahrain. China wants Assad to stay. Now, why do Putin and Assad why do Putin and China want Assad to stay? Mainly because of the fact they also have Arab populations back home, especially the Muslims, especially the Russians. And most of them are who? Sunnis. And they're afraid that if the Sunnis throw Assad out, it might give them some guts back in Russia and China. And they don't want that. So they're going to make sure Assad stays. At the same time, what's happened north? Ukraine. What's going on there is also connected to what's going on down here. Why? Crimea. Why do you think Putin grabbed the Crimea? Because it's that warm weather access from the Black Sea, the Sea of Marmara, Dardanelles, so on and so forth, into the Mediterranean. So what Crimea is actually tied to what goes on in Syria. He wants that Navy base there. Something the British never wanted the Russians to have. So now that you're not just talking about the Middle East, you're talking about the Crimea. This is like going to the ball game, you need a scorecard. This is basically what you're seeing. So now you have these people in the Middle East fighting for whatever it is they're fighting for. And then you have the larger picture, regional hegemony between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And then there's a strategic hegemony between the United States, China, Russia wanting to maintain it. It's like again, throwing a rock in the pond and watching the ripples go out 360 degrees. It's not getting any clearer here. And again, what happens in Syria to a certain extent and what happens in Ukraine and Crimea, they're tied. They're tied together. Again, this is all part of what was known in the 19th century as the Great Game.
So Iran is increasing its defense spending for this year by 40%, even though you have declining oil prices. They're building up their Caspian fleet. Russia.
So is Putin.
Well, yeah, and that's what I was going to say. Russia Putin is inflaming Islamic divides in the Caucasus. What do you see happening there?
Well, let me start by saying the fascinating thing about Putin is, last year they took a poll in Russia. 46% of the people agree with Putin wanting to rebuild that million-man army. They agree with more tanks. They agree with more planes. They agree with more. He wants to rebuild the Russian Navy inside of next 10, 15 years. They agree with this. In fact, I remember I talked to a couple of guys I know who do business in Russia. And you know, when you go to the airports, right? You know, you go to the candy stores, buy candy or cigarettes, whatever the case may be, right? They picked up they picked up some chocolates, individually wrapped chocolates. And you take off the cellophane, right? There's the cheap tin foil inside the chocolate's wrapped in. Undo the tin foil, and you take the chocolate off, and guess whose picture's at the bottom of the Stalin. Stalin. They took a poll a couple of years ago. 29% of the people would like a Stalin back. It represents order. I almost fell off my chair. I said, "You're kidding." I said, "No. Stalin. Good old Uncle Joe. You can't get rid of him." Yes.
But it's interesting that you used the word order just now, because one of the things that I see with the Middle East, ongoing. They may claim these are religious wars. They may claim that it's really a land grab, it's a resource grab. But bottom line, they can't keep it together because there's no order. It's like a house of dominoes that keeps falling.
Well, keep in mind, a lot of these areas are tribal.
That's why.
And there's always been beefs and differences of opinion between tribes. Take, for instance, the Mongols. I love this example because this is the perfect example. You know, for a long time, the Sung Chinese in the north, I'm going back to the 11th, 12th century, that kind of thing. You know, they always played one tribe off against the other. These people lived on the steppe. They were highly competitive, great horsemen. You couldn't want better horsemen. However, they were always in competition for the scant resources that existed on the steppe. Until one man comes along. His name is Temujin, who will later take the name Genghis Khan. What he does, and I always remember that old show, The Untouchables, with Robert Stack? I always remember Nehemiah Persoff as Jake Greasy Thumbs Guzik, the Capone's bookkeeper. I brought order to the business, you know? This is what Genghis Khan does. He brings order to the Mongols, the Tatars, the Uyghurs, the Hazaras, the Turkomans. And he brings all these tribes together. And then what happens when he does? You couldn't stop him because of superior horsemanship. And they just flood. They go, in fact, at one point, the Mongol Empire goes from Vladivostok to the Polish border. It's the grandest empire ever put together strictly by military means. It's brutal, yes. Now let's go to 1258, the Abbasid Caliphate. You know, at one point, Baghdad was the place to be. It was the class place for learning, literature, and so on and so forth. Mathematics, they had a class irrigation system for the time. And it was miles ahead of Europe. Of course, Europe was still in the Dark Ages at this point. But not in 1258. Hulagu Khan comes along, Genghis Khan's grandson. I only use the term visit. He descends on Baghdad in 1258. There are 1 million people who live here. When he leaves, there's only 200,000 left. Tore the city apart. The irrigation system, the model irrigation system, destroyed. These people in this place we call Iraq never recovered from this. This is 8 centuries. There are areas in Central Asia that the Mongols were like a human atomic bomb. That's what they were. But again, what happened after Genghis Khan's sons died? Fell apart. It's all tribal. Plus, they got too big for their britches. And then some of them, they lost the allure of ruling their empire on horseback. Once they did that, they were done. But for the time that they stayed on the saddle, you couldn't beat them. They were almost unbeatable. Yeah. They're probably the most successful army that traipsed across the face of the earth. I argue that they're the best horsemen that ever lived.
And the best.
Yeah, they were something. Yes.
But you really could say something similar to order brought about by fear. if you take a look at Assad's father, when he wiped out the city in northern Syria, turned it into a parking lot, it gave the people the idea, don't mess with me.
Well, Saddam did the same sort of thing at Haditha,
Right.
with the chemical weapons, which we sold them during the Iran-Iraq War.
So when you take a look at these tribal leaders, what do you do with them? I mean, they're there, they're not going away, unless you somehow get them to coalesce. They don't want to coalesce.
Well, no, they all have their own agendas. I mean, this has been going on for centuries. And then there's the sectarian divide. Now, some people don't put much stock in that, some people do. But you can't ignore the sectarian divide between Sunnis and Shias. You can't ignore it. This goes back to the 7th century when Ali was murdered in 661. You know, I mean, the Sunnis don't believe in a bloodline. You know, they believe a caliphate should be who? Someone who's politically astute, knows the people, the politics, so on and so forth. You know, somebody generally acceptable as a caliphate. The Shias believe in the bloodline. That's what they believe. I mean, there are some Catholics I know that believe that Jesus married Mary Magdalene in the Catholic Church should be based on a bloodline.
So the Sunnis believe in the bloodline?
No, they don't.
It's the other way.
Correct.
Shia bloodline.
Correct. And the Shias are the minority, the distinct minority. They're only like 15% of the Islamic religion. I mean, they hold dear to the same basic beliefs, but you know the difference between you know a bloodline and non-bloodline is a big difference, and they haven't overcome this. So, and has that accentuated the sectarian divide? Sure, especially when certain leaders use it for that. Going back to the Ottoman Turks and the Safavid Persians.
Well, not only do you have that religious split, but there's an ethnic split that comes along with the.
Of course,
Shia.
yeah, because the Persians are not Arabs.
Yeah.
They're Persians. So, yes, there's that as well. So there are a lot of variables here which prevent these people from getting together. Yes?
Yeah. But the Shia is a majority in Iraq. Is that 60%?
Yeah.
Correct. Correct. However, don't be misled by that, because when Saddam invaded Iran in 1980, thousands of Shia Arabs joined his banner to invade Persia, to invade Iran. So that didn't make any difference.
Well, he was a Sunni, right?
Correct. But those Shias in Iraq were Arabs, and they joined Saddam for that. Well, part of that was to grab Khuzestan, that province in the west, which many Arabs in the Middle East feel that that's part of the Arab fold. So yeah, it didn't make any difference whether some of those people were Sunnis or Shias. They joined Saddam and attacked. Of course, the war didn't work out quite as well. So. And again, that's one of the reasons they went with chemical weapons anyway, because of the fact they were outnumbered 3-1. So that's another story. Yes?
We've been talking all evening about the creation of colonialism and what that created in this area. What if there hadn't been an era of interference motivated by colonialism?
Oh man, that's a whole new talk. Well, the fact of the matter is, these people have not really been allowed to maybe take these ideas and deal with them themselves. Could things have been different? Maybe. You can't say for sure because it didn't happen. But could these people have dealt with these issues on their own? Perhaps. Would you have seen something different than an Islamic state? Perhaps. But I mean, keep in mind, you're still talking about an area in many respects that's tribal, clannish. I mean, when the British drew the borders with the French, they drew these borders through clannish associations, tribal affiliations, religious differences, and ethnic passions. They didn't take into account these differences or these varieties. And is that partly responsible for the